Hello. Today I will be discussing the history of the Coon Creek Watershed in Minnesota. So, leading up to today, much of class has been talking about different fluvial processes, and more specifically, sediment transport. So, just to recap on the things that we've been going over, sediment is transported downstream in one of three ways, depending on its size. You have the suspended load, which is basically sediments being transported downstream in the center of the water column. And then you have the bed load, which are particles that the stream has enough power to carry and transport, but they are heavier than the suspended particles. So they are just sort of bouncing and rolling along the stream bed, and they're bumping into boulders and rocks that at this time the stream doesn't have enough power to carry. Of course, in the event of a massive discharge event, even those stones could be picked up if the stream power is enough. And then, of course, you have your dissolved load, which are the ions and minerals that are completely dissolved in the water. So we know how sediment is transported down a stream, but let's also recap how sediment gets into a stream in the first place. So these are just two examples of some different types of erosional processes that we've previously talked about. The one on the left is a slab failure, where an entire chunk of the bank breaks off and falls into the stream, and then all of that sediment becomes available for transport. Then the one on the right is the result of undercutting, where the water in the stream sort of eats away at the bank, and the water level has been staying pretty low. It's created this cavern, and eventually the top of the cavern can't support itself anymore, and it just crumbles into the stream. And again, all of that sediment is now available for transport. But both of these processes are happening to the stream bed and banks themselves within the stream channel. But what about the land around it? The stream in this photo doesn't seem nearly large enough to have the power to do that scale of erosion. There's a horse in that photograph for scale. This is a massive gully that those levels of erosion couldn't possibly be from that tiny little stream. How about this one? There isn't even a stream in this pit. It's just a pit. So clearly there are some processes happening in this area that are more than just stream power and bank erosion. There's something else going on here. So the last two photos have been taken from the Coon Creek Watershed in eastern Wisconsin, which in the late 1800s and well into the 1900s was facing massive destruction of land, and it's largely associated with the agricultural practices that were being used at the time. Something that you might have noticed in the past two pictures and in this one is that there is very little vegetation. Maybe some grass. This one has a couple trees that don't look particularly happy. And you might be thinking, oh, agriculture, like wheat and crops. And yes, crop fields were suffering severe topsoil loss, but these are photographs from cattle fields. Now, we already know that vegetation helps hold soil together and prevent erosion. But when you allow your cattle to free roam, they tend to overgraze, and now the vegetation is gone. Then on top of that, you have giant herds of cattle walking around, and their hooves are disturbing and loosening the soil. All it takes is one rain event, and the water will start running down the slopes, picking up soil and washing it down. And that's what you see here in this photo. These are giant rills caused by rain eroding the soil and washing it away. It gets concentrated into those channels because water always takes the most efficient path. But surely, the crop fields couldn't be having this bad of an issue because they're vegetated and they aren't being trampled by cattle, right? Well, when you've been farming and farming and farming the same land in vast quantities, tilling it and loosening the topsoil so you can plant your crops, then there's next to no structure in the soil anymore because of all of that tilling. And then it rains. And when it rains, you end up with sheet flow, which basically just picks up sheets of water and sediment and carries it down slope. The crops will be ruined by this, and they get totally wiped out by sliding sheets of water and sediment. Now, something really interesting is that we actually have records of the sediment output by the Coon Creek into the Mississippi River. So what we know is that we have a massive amounts of sediment being washed off of the landscape, and we would expect it to make its way into the tributaries, through the watershed, and eventually into the Mississippi via all those methods of transport that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. But that's not actually what happened. So this is a figure that I took from an article by Stanley Trimble, who wrote a series of articles based off of his research on the sediment accretion in the Coon Creek watershed. This particular figure is from his 1999 article. So let's zoom in on the top portion of this figure because that's the time period that we're focused on right now. So on the right side of this figure, you can see all the massive amounts of sediment that is being mobilized and washed off of the landscapes and into the watershed. And it would make total sense to predict that most of it would end up traveling all the way to the Mississippi. But when we look over here on the left, the output of sediment into the Mississippi is way lower. In fact, if we go back to this slide, it looks like the sediment output into the Mississippi is staying relatively stable over the entire 100 years that this data was recorded. How is that possible? Well, if you think about it, we've talked a lot about stream power in the previous classes and even a little bit today. Here's the function again for stream power. And there's nothing on here about sediment. That's because the capacity for a stream to do work is determined by discharge, slope, gravity, and water density. So even if there is ample sediment available, a stream can only do so much work because the stream power is limited by the stream itself, not the sediment. So that begs the question, where is all that sediment going? Well, some of it is going to the Mississippi, but not very much. Only about 8% of the sediment that enters anywhere in the watershed ends up in the Mississippi River. The rest of these are called sinks, and they are essentially long-term storage for sediment. Most of the sediment ends up filling the valleys, and particularly the lower end of the main Coon Creek Valley that runs through the watershed. I mean, we're talking almost 50% of all the sediment being washed away is ending up in this stretch of the valley between the years of 1853 and 1938. And of course, within those valleys, there are some erosional processes taking place, like an active cut bank. But by and large, the sediment just sits there. Some of the other places that sediment might be deposited are in the tributary valleys, and then also a small percentage does get washed down a slope, but stays in the upland valleys instead of making its way into the streams. But again, Almost 50% of all of the sediment will end up in the lower stretch of the main Coon Creek Valley. So naturally, farmers are not happy about all of this. Their crops are being washed away. The valleys are filling with silt and sediment. It's not good. So they started campaigning for help. The issue, of course, was not limited to Coon Creek either. This was a widespread issue across the Midwest. And in 1933, Congress devoted $5 billion to the formation of the Soil Erosion Service, led by expert Hugh Bennett. Bennett had campaigned heavily for help, and when he was nominated to lead this service, he chose the Coon Creek Watershed as the first demonstration project for erosion control. Many of the conservation practices that were implemented by Bennett are actually still used today for erosion control. Some of those include contour strips, terraces, diversions, grade control structures, and one of the key pieces was vegetation restoration. Over 500,000 tree seedlings were planted, and you can see the effect that it had on the landscapes. In 1940, there on the left, that stream channel is extremely shallow and wide, caused by extreme sediment deposition. Then 35 years later, there are trees stabilizing the landscape, and the channel has narrowed and deepened. That landscape is surely much more stable with all those tree roots holding the soil together. Another practice, of course, was to fence off the cattle and prevent them from climbing steep hillsides, which are, of course, much more vulnerable to erosion. The best part about all of this is that it worked. The new practices were wildly successful, and within 1 year, crop production increased dramatically, with some farmers saying that they had 5 times the crop yield as the previous year. And then within a few years, some anecdotes report that farmers were building add-ons to their barns to store excess crop harvest. The contour lines that you see in the photo on the left became iconic to the hay farms in the area, and they had remarkable effectiveness in reducing soil erosion. Returning to this figure from Trimble's research, you can now see the clear decrease in sediment input into the Coon Creek watershed. You can also see that the output to the Mississippi is still about the same even over all 100 years. As time goes on, the Soil Erosion Service continues its work and more farmers joined the program. Less and less sediment eroded from the landscape and into the watershed. If you look closely, some of the sediment deposition in the upper valleys is actually able to be washed away. And then by the time we get to the 1990s, the sheer amount of sediment being transported anywhere in the watershed is only a fraction of what it was in the late 1800s. Today, the Soil Erosion Service is known as the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And as the number of dairy farms in the area decreases, the demand for hay also decreases. So the iconic soil erosion prevention contour strips are actually being removed. Fortunately, technology today allows for planting and growing crops that don't require tilling, and the results are comparable with the effects of the contour lines. Continued proper land management and sustainable crop harvest will prevent situations like the one in Coon Creek from happening again in the future. Thank you.